I believe we do have a connection to the land. And how do you describe that? Well, and one thing it might be that you can stand on a rise and you can look out, you can look 15 k's east to the sunset. You can stand on a little hill and watch the sun come up in the morning. You can just watch the mood of the country from your high point. But I think that my other connection to the land is, having spent years farming it, is the smell of the earth, the understanding of what it's like when it's wet or what it's like when it's dry is just something that I think we've been privileged to have been able to witness. And then probably more lately, and I think the thing that I hope that more and more people, more and more Australians can become involved in.
In this part of the Murray Basin, there's an amazing story of changes in water, changes in lakes, changes in the shoreline, which is very relevant to the people on the land who live in this country. So the stories then begins in this part of the land with the sea, which extended from the present coastline right up past Mildura, about 500 kilometres further inland, at a time now which is well understood, about 6 million years ago. The sea then gradually retreated from this landscape, and it left behind this extraordinary pattern of arcuate shorelines, the shoreline ridges that sweep up to the northwest from here, ridges around Garoke, Edenhope, and inland from Natimuck, Nil, and of course further north. They provide probably one of the most detailed records of sea level change in the world for the last 6 million years. And of course, in those earlier days, places like Arapiles would have been an island in the sea.
It's not only a full stop at the end of the Great Dividing Range, but it's sort of an axle around which a lot of different geography revolves. When you stand on top of the mount and look due north, you can see the Little Desert, which is only a few miles north. That merges straight into the Big Desert, then the Sunset Country, and then straight up north into the real outback. So it's right on the edge of the desert. Not many miles to the south, you've got the verdant Western District, quite a green area. To the east, you've got the Wimmera cropping lands, the fertile black soil country, lots of rivers, streams, watercourses, lakes. To the west of the mount, there's no notable river except for swamps, wetlands in between the ancient coastal dunes. The mount itself, I believe, was at one time during the Murray-Darling inundation, was an island. The Grampians fringed the ancient ocean. It would have been just amazing to be there, millions of years ago, and sit on top of Island or Arapiles and probably be surrounded by gannets and terns and albatrosses and things and the crashing waves. There is evidence of wave action on the rock around Mount Arapiles.
As you drive across this landscape, that series of ridges, the ridges and the depressions, were the old shorelines and the sort of the swales between the shoreline dunes, ridges which are probably most clearly defined as you go down to Narracourt, the Narracourt ridges, because up here, Garoke and inland towards Caniva, the ridges are really defined most clearly by the bands of wetlands. The wetlands in between the ridges have formed by a process of climatic change after the retreat of the sea. So the sea retreat are formed under quite wet conditions. The rainfall was much, much higher than it is today.
The dune swale system are part of that northwest dune field. Those farmers who have dunes and swales know that the swales are much more productive in most years, and the dunes themselves are prone to needing more nutrients. They're also more acid, so we've got two distinctly different soil types. Basically, good production in normal years comes off the swales, and the better production comes off the dunes in years of light rainfall.
Geologically important events occurred as the sea retreated past Edenhope. The earth movements began in such a way that this part of the landscape began to rise. So that ridges here at Natimak, Garoak, Edenhope, while they were deposited at sea level, are now, 150, 160 metres above sea level. So whilst the sea level has fallen a little, the land has actually come up. And we can say that places like Edenhope, Garoak, which is I think about 160 metres, have risen almost 160 metres in the last 2 to 3 million years. So those earth movements are actually still going on. This land is still slowly rising. Those earth movements had another very important effect. As the land began to rise, the access to the sea was blocked, and a huge lake formed up north of here called Lake Bungunya. It then had to find an overflow. There was so much water, although the lake extended over a radius of 200 kilometres, it still had to find its way to the sea. It found an overflow channel from the present location of Lake Hindmarsh down here past Arapiles and down towards the coastline, which was then located down near Douglas. So that overflow channel then carved out many of the old sand ridges. It cut a trench through the old shorelines and developed what is today known as the Douglas Depression, or the trench in which the present Wimmera River is now located. So Hindmarsh, Albucacha, and of course the salt lakes down near Douglas are now just windows into the groundwater, and the evaporation through those windows, like windows into the subsurface water, evaporation concentrates the salt, so you end up then with this chain of salt lakes in that area of the depression. As the land kept rising, it got too high for that channel down at Douglas to meet the sea. It was blocked also. So the lake then became isolated. It had no outlet to the sea. It then had to find another way out, and it broke through over near, in South Australia, along the foothills of the Flinders Ranges. It broke through to the sea over near Mannum. And as it drained, the lake drained over there and formed the course of the present Murray River.
The southwest Wimmera is a fascinating area, and I think the thing that really stands out is as you drive across it, you're taking cross-section of this succession of dunes, and the vegetation explains it all. And I'm sure that our forefathers were fully aware of this and picked that certain vegetation types delineate a particular soil type, and that's how the land has been developed the way it was, and probably explains why today most of the native vegetation that still remains in the southwest Wimmera is primarily the stringy bark heathy systems, which is generally on those sandy soils along the dune lines, and probably a lot of the other vegetation that remains is also around the wetlands.
wetlands in between the ridges have formed by a process of climatic change after the retreat of the sea. The swales, the depressions between the ridges, which then became closed depressions, the rainfall just formed swamps and a whole series of closed basins in the old ridges between the old shorelines. That's why sometimes during high rainfall they'll overflow, connect, and then the system flows off, often flows to the north due to the tilt. As the landscape has come up, there's a slight drainage here to the north. So those basins then went through a history of their own. Some of them in the past, during wet periods, they were permanently full basins, many of them for a long time. When that happens, you get a nice sandy beach develops on the eastern shoreline. So many of those wetlands have a big sand ridge on the eastern side. When the lake is full, sand blows off the beach. But when the basin starts to dry, when the climate becomes drier, the system switches. And instead of getting nice sandy beaches, we get wind action and a bit of salt which concentrates blowing off the shores of those what were once wetlands. Then you get a clay dune develops. And so on some of those basins you'll get a sand dune and a clay dune. Not all of those have the two different types. But they're telling us a story of how the wetlands have changed in the past. So the wetlands we see today are quite different from those that were there, say, 20, 30,000 years ago.
Of the terminal lakes, I think the most interesting one at the moment to look at is Lake Hindmarsh, where we've got a drying out of the whole system, and wherever there are obstacles, you've got the accumulation of sand against those obstacles and new dunes forming and a new set of dunes on the east side. So you're getting a different shoreline. And as that process goes on, so the lake moves or gets smaller and smaller because it's depositing more and more sand onto that eastern side.
About 1 million years ago, the globe went into big cycles of change, from warm interglacials, like we are in now. They don't last very long. Then the climate would deteriorate into a cold phase. When it's cold, there's less evaporation, but less evaporation from the ocean means there's less rainfall. So although it's cold, it was very dry. Now, the Aboriginal people lived through those periods, and they saw, during those phases, the mobilisation of many of the sand ridges. Those dunes, the big desert, little desert, they were mobilised, reworked a lot of the sands that were sitting there from the old shorelines, masses of sands. Then remove the vegetation by climate or by people, and away go the sand dunes. And in those cold periods, the sand dunes, there were so many of them, they all linked up. And you'll get these big areas now like the big desert, little desert, where you continuous sand dunes. It's a bit like, what we're doing today. We are removing the vegetation at great risk because, we are emulating, we are redoing what nature did in the past. Remove the vegetation, then the dunes will start to blow.
And then you've got the big and little deserts, which just seem to be just one big heap of sand, which is quite different. And hence they're amazing areas. They are steeper on the eastern side, so they have a gentle slope up from the southwest. These sand dune systems are blown in from the southwest to overlay the land.
So this landscape has that one of the few places in the world where we get this extraordinary story of changing sea level. On top of that, they're changing the landscapes coming up. Now we're living through another time of big change. Now we're in the drought we're in at the moment is probably a short term, we hope, but we're certainly in the long term, we've moved into another period of major climate change. So we have to remember then that this landscape has been formed through a previous pattern of climatic change. But this one is a big worry because the rate of change now is much faster than it occurred naturally in the past. So these are issues which are going to really require a lot of care and a lot of wisdom in the next 50 years, because our children are growing up in a landscape with a rainfall water balance that's not the one that our parents and that we grew up with. How much has it changed in the past? How do the present situation compare with the past? And can we then, from that, make some predictions about how it might change if we manage it in the future? It's a collaborative exercise with the managers, with the water managers and the scientists. Depends it very much on the strength of understanding and the records of the community.